Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And again, this is Research Through Broken Lenses, the Need to Shift Left in UXR. I am Dr. Michelle A. Williams, and I like to introduce myself as equal parts user experience researcher and accessibility specialist and consultant. And I'm really excited to bring this presentation that speaks to the intersection of both of those worlds. By the way, you can also find me on LinkedIn if you want to connect. Before I begin, I actually want to pause and talk about how I'll be talking about disability in this presentation. In particular, I'm going to be using what's known as identity first language, as in disabled people. And part of that is because of the way that we are going to be emphasizing disability in terms of UX research and accessibility, but also in general, I align with those that feel disability is not a bad word, not a word to be avoided, but rather as a descriptor. I honor those who have other differing opinions, but again, for the purposes of this presentation, I just wanted to know that we will be using that as the language for the presentation. So speaking of which, here's what we're going to go through today. So first, we're going to define UX research and talk about what that is, and then talk about engaging disabled research participants in those activities. Then we're going to talk about how to start shifting left, and lastly, how to fix our lenses. So let's go ahead. What is UX research? Okay, let's start with a definition and a long wall of text, but we'll make it through. From the Interaction Design Foundation, I really like their explanation of what is UX research. User experience research is the systematic study of target users and their requirements to add realistic context and insights to design processes. UX researchers adopt various methods to uncover problems and design opportunities. Doing so, they reveal valuable information which can be fed into the design process. Now, the thing is, when people hear the definition of UX research, they kind of home in on design processes. And so they hear that there is a bringing in, say, of target users, understanding their requirements to give insight into the design process. A lot of times that leads to thinking that this is related to usability studies. But I want to start at the very beginning and make sure we are clear that UX research is not equal to usability studies. Usability studies are one type of research method intended for evaluating final or near final designs. There are many steps that occur prior to that phase of getting to the final design that should be validated with users, including your initial idea. So another way to think about this is to go through some seminal work by Jesse James Garrett, The Elements of UX. Basically building a system, whether it's your own personal website, a software application, or a presentation for a conference, has many stages and phases. And in the simplified view of that work, there are 5 phases that move between abstract and concrete. For instance, you start with the strategy, where it all begins. What is the purpose? What are the user needs and desires? Then you move to the scope. What are the requirements based on the strategy that you created? Then you move to the structure. Okay, well, how does that lay out? Say, what is the navigation? What is the information architecture based on those requirements? You build a skeleton around that, some pieces and parts and components of what that would look like. Then finally, there's a surface, the visual design, which everyone eventually engages with, but that's not where you start. Now, these phases come iteratively, and on the next slide, I have the more detailed version of that shows these phases, whether for web design or software design, but they do build on each other. Now, they can be cyclical and you can revisit each one, but keep in mind that there are various stages that go into the making of something, whether it's a hardware device, a software application, a website, etc. Well, if there are various stages, user research should be part of each of those stages. So I'm going to show a diagram that actually is not from formal research or a presentation, but rather from Julian Missick's personal website. But I really like this diagram because it takes the elements of user experience and pairs it with various research methods that can and should accompany each phase. basically research methods move from what's known as either generative or foundational to summative. So where we have that strategy phase of user needs or site objectives, there are equally research methods like contextual inquiry, which is basically an observation in someone's current environment, or interviews that can engage with people, understand the environment in which that product is going to sit, and give you insight into the people for whom you are designing. Then you move up into other methods that tie into, say, prototypes, prototype walkthroughs, storyboarding, all the way up to what we know as usability studies at that final stage. So again, there are hundreds of research methods, more being invented. I really enjoyed the book that was recommended to me by a colleague some years ago, Universal Methods of Design, Bella Martin and Bruce Hennington, literally 100 ways to research. And so if there are over 100 different methods to gather contextual information about users, we should definitely be exploring those. As mentioned, they include contextual inquiry. There's one that I love called a diary study, where you get people to reflect on certain prompts in their day using a diary. Heuristic evaluations, particularly of not only the product you're making, but you can do that of other similar products, and similarly competitive analysis and testing. So again, there are a lot of ways to gather information that can feed back into what you're going to design. So really what UX research is contextual insights. So basically, you can't be user-centered, but only evaluate final designs with users. So a lot of people profess to be user-centered, but you can't go off in your corner, build an entire thing, then present it to someone and say, we got it right, didn't we? That's not user-centered, that's not human-centered design. So instead, we need to recognize that solutions sit within an entire ecosystem of people's lives. So UX research clarifies the project direction and fortifies your plans from beginning to end to make sure that what you are projecting to create will sit within that ecosystem in a way that you expect, that you intend. Even if you intend disruption, you can understand the effects of that and confirm your assumptions, confirm your ideas without getting too far into the process. So a key takeaway for what is UX research is that UX research is not for validating your idea. It's for guiding you to the right idea. And what I mean by that is, again, it's not about getting all the way to a final design and then asking someone to simply validate that. Instead, it is for guiding you towards what you should make and those decisions all along the way. So now we get into section 2, engaging disabled participants. So UX research involves people. The research participants are supposed to be a representative set of the anticipated users of the product or service you are creating. So if that's the case, disabled users are users too. A representative sample for any product or service includes disabled people. And when I say disability here, I'm including the entire diversity of physical, cognitive, neurological. Nonetheless, disability is going to be represented. And with that, I have a maybe controversial statement, but there is no group of people without disability present unless there's active discrimination. Now that may sound a little harsh, but here's what I mean. Because disability is so prevalent, we know the numbers such as 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people from things like the census or CDC. We know those don't even account for cognitive disabilities as much as they probably should or can, because those don't have as much diagnoses and accounting for them. And they only include adults and not children. So if disability is all around us and so many people that we know, how is it that we then create products and say there are no people with disabilities that will use this? Instead, I think that people are actively saying there won't be people with disabilities who use this. So that is a form of discrimination. That is a form of exclusion. Really, disability, again, is going to be present whether you know it or not, realize it or not, or acknowledge it or not. because disabled users are users too. So then that leads to, well, don't we have guidelines that account for that? And isn't that enough when we're talking about, say, designing and building? The answer is no. I actually had a conversation about this. And one of the things I said was, teams will conduct research with non-disabled people because they know design guidelines are not enough. Oftentimes you don't get a pushback about research, but sometimes you get a pushback about including disabled people in research. But if we do research with non-disabled people, why does disability get excluded? Basically, having a disability should not override the same ability to provide perspectives and feedback. So there's a mismatch here, thinking that the guidelines will cover it. Oftentimes, the reason that comes up is because people are equating accessibility with usability, but again, they are not the same. Accessibility is a baseline measure of being able to access and contribute to technology. Usability is a fundamental measure of the usefulness and understandability of the technology. So in short, product teams assess accessibility. Users assess usability. They are not one and the same. In addition, when we're talking about including disabled participants in research, we have to recognize that inclusion doesn't come last. So oftentimes when disabled participants are brought up as part of a user research cycle, usually it's after the product is made and you think that you are engaging with folks with disabilities in order to evaluate what you've created. But disability inclusion is not a final checklist item. It is basically a human imperative, as we heard even in some of the opening keynotes from the conference. So also, the diversity of disability makes it necessary to have perspectives early and often. It is very difficult to account for all of the different ways that varying abilities have an impact on technology usage, mental models, understanding, without including those perspectives early and often and iteratively. Lastly, as a bonus, the diverse perspectives produce innovation. So as we've heard over and over again, even at this very conference, the irony is that the diverse perspectives breed more innovation. They breed more thought about how something can be, more imagination of how something can be when you have that diversity of abilities or thinking or ways of doing things. So that's why the inclusion shouldn't come at the very, very end or not be included at all. It will continue to strengthen your ideas going forward. So a key takeaway when we're talking about UXR and that inclusion of disabled participants is that true inclusion isn't bolted on at the end, it's built in from the beginning. So in the title of my presentation, I talked about how to shift left or the need to shift left. And if you're not familiar with that term, that essentially is a phrasing that came about through different activists and specialists imploring people to take the project timeline or the project outline and move accessibility left in that timeline, move it earlier in the process. So what I'm hoping is that we can move some of these actions earlier in our processes, particularly within the UX research field. So the first of that, however, is to conduct more foundational research regardless. So I come from an industry background, but also an academic background as well. In academia, it's a little more common to do foundational or generative or exploratory research prior to starting a project. But in industry, you find a little more resistance to that. But basically, foundational or generative research, which is often overlooked and misunderstood, should instead be equated with a building's foundation. It's critical for a successful outcome, but sometimes it can be hard to convince people of that. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that, again, it can be iterative. So I recognize, for instance, in industry, there's a lot of focus on getting a product out the door, getting it into the lives of users so that it can start to be used, generate revenue, get the feedback, and present itself as the business opportunity that it's supposed to be. So you can interject foundational research into that, but you still need to be intentional about it. So to build on that a little bit more, for instance, it helps to have leadership buy-in to do this, but sometimes that may come after you prove the worth of doing the more contextual, kind of insightful research rather than just research on the actual thing you built. And then also, you may have to go rogue a few times in order to get it done, in order to prove that worth. But sometimes there are slower periods of production where that happens. I want to give an ode to a previous manager. She had us do this during a down period, and it worked really well because we were able to take a time when the teams weren't really looking for the constant usability feedback. They were a little more still. We were able to do some really in-depth research with our populations, which were at the time students. And then when we brought that information back, when we brought back that deeper contextual information about what students are doing in the classroom, it led to new product ideas, it reinvigorated the team, and it really proved the worth of getting in and doing that kind of research with our participants beyond, again, just putting a finished product in front of them and getting those final evaluations. So then if we fit that in, then the next way to shift left is to then include disabled participants in all of those research activities. Basically, don't get to it later, get to it always. Disability is not solely a factor in accessibility projects. So oftentimes there's an accessibility initiative and people will say, well, we should bring in disabled users. And so that tends to associate with testing for accessibility. No, instead, we should be testing for all factors of inclusion, and that includes disabled users and representation from the variety of physical, cognitive, and neurological conditions that are within this realm of what we call disability. So again, we are looking to diversify who we're even considering when we're talking about research and research participants. And I'll pause here to give a shout out. Someone on LinkedIn asked me to make sure that I say that the representation of the participants that come in for research should include, multiple people within a, say, category of disability. So the other thing that usually happens is we'll say, okay, we're bringing in blind folks and we bring in 3 blind folks, whatever that looks like. But that's, maybe the totality of it. Or we bring in 1 blind person, 1 low vision person, 1 deaf person. There's a variety within each of those categories. There's variety within a person who has multiple disabilities. So make sure that you are considering the totality of what disability represents in every study that you take on, and then keep building on that knowledge. So there's the point that someone asked me to make. I hope I made it well. The next thing that comes to mind, though, is usually how. How do we get into that? I'm not going to spend the remainder of the talk going into that in too much detail. I'll return to that towards the end. But also note that particularly when we're talking about foundational methods like observations, they don't need as much adapting as other more summative methods like prototype testing. So for instance, there are a variety of ways to gather the data that doesn't take as much building up as some of the other, again, prototype or final product methods. It does, however, take an open mind and some initial research to understand the situations that you are observing. So that is the thing to keep in mind, and we're going to spend a little more time on that in just a moment. However, another thing that comes to mind as people talk about, as I talk about doing more research with more participants, more diversity, won't it take more time? Again, going back to the idea that I'm familiar with industry, I'm familiar with some of the timelines, but the first response that I always say to won't it take more time is that time estimates are based on intentions. That is, you estimate your time based on what you intend to do. So activities don't take more time if they are what you intended to do. So I think there needs to be a shift, not necessarily in thinking of this as an add-on, but instead ensuring that project activities promote inclusive practices, and thus everything else will balance itself out, because your mindset is going to be that we are an inclusive culture. Therefore, these are the activities we take upon ourselves, and therefore these are the timelines and tasks that we do accordingly. Now, finally, as I espouse all of this about foundational research, I'll be honest that there are some risks, and I want to point them out and be very upfront about them. The first risk is that it may reveal you don't have the right solution. Foundational research and going out and visiting with people might reveal that maybe the thing you thought you needed to create won't actually solve the problem you thought it would. Maybe instead there's an environmental change that needs to happen or a systemic change that needs to happen, not necessarily a product that you wanted to make, but that's something that you probably want to know before you go all the way through and make that product. It may also expose some hard truths like the impact of social inequity. Depending on what you think you're going to get into, you may again find that the world is not, this place without bad things happening. And so if that's the case, what does that mean for what you are about to embark on? And are you able to account for that in what you design? And again, is what you're designing actually going to get at the heart of what you're finding out from really doing the contextual work? It may also reveal that the internal goal for the organization that you're working with is not actual change. Because if you find that you don't have the right solution or that the solution has some systemic attachments to it, you may find that people say, we don't care, or we're not going to address that. That's outside of what we're going to do. But my thing is, let's stop ignoring those harder questions. We need to look at these issues in earnest and really try to create solutions, whether they're products, whether they're systems, whether they're policies, that really get at the heart of actual change, rather than continuing to make the same things over and over without giving ourselves opportunity to see the realities of where those systems are sitting. So a key takeaway for this sort of section about shifting left is that basically, is this accessible is not a research question. That actually was an alternative title even for this presentation. So is this accessible is not a research question. Instead, disabled participants need to be authentically included in robust research. So again, we're not bringing people in, as we call it, just to check the accessibility of what we've built. We're bringing them in to get authentic insights. And that happens through robust research. That happens through research that is really set up to give us the true and authentic contextual insights that will help us in building out our products. So given this, the last section is how to fix our lenses if we're going to embark on this research. As mentioned, I didn't want to spend too much time on adapting methods or giving feedback on how to, go about doing a diary study or a contextual inquiry, because I think another avenue or section that we don't think about as much when we're talking about research is the viewpoint of the researcher. And particularly when we're talking about engaging with disability, I think that we should start a different place than just figuring out facilitation tips or even doing related research, but first thinking about what we're thinking about. Thinking about our viewpoints of disability is going to be important for then interpreting those results, and again, authentically including disabled people in the research that we're trying to do, particularly if we're talking about the more contextual kind of research. So for instance, one question to ask ourselves is when we're talking about a research activity or a product goal, is the goal assimilation or inclusion? Here's what I mean by that. Oftentimes when you see research that intentionally includes disabled people, it's often from a viewpoint of inventing for assimilation, as in someone can't do something a certain way, so we need to fix it or them. So a blind person, their navigation doesn't include visual feedback, so we need to provide some technology, outfit that person with some technology to supplement that. Or there's some sort of, usually some sort of outfit or exoskeleton or something that we want to outfit that person with in order to allow them to do something a certain way. But what if there's just simply an alternative way to do something? Is there room in our research? Is there room in our findings and in our products to account for that? So really embracing alternatives moves us toward true diversity, equity, and inclusion. I just don't think we often are embracing those alternatives. In fact, our views are often what's known as ableist. So your viewpoint of disability will guide how you approach every activity. And oftentimes it will be influenced by something known as ableism. That is, at a basic level, a disregard or a lessened view of disabled people. So here's some examples of that you may have encountered in every day. Saying but, and this is a blog post that I actually have, stop saying but. That would be as in, he's blind, but he goes to work every day. No, hopefully you see that that sentence those two things shouldn't be connected with a but in the middle. Or another example is applauding technology presented as innovation, but eschewing it or rebuffing it as an accommodation, such as text-to-speech for reading. So Audible, an audio book, using that to listen to books on an audio format is seen as a good use of time, a great way to get the information in. Some people really enjoy it, and it maximizes their ability to get information that is found in books, but maybe they don't have time to sit down and open one up or read it on their tablet. So that's an innovation that sometimes is looked upon favorably. But when a student wants to listen to their textbook in an audio format as an accommodation for school, that's looked at as the student is trying to get an advantage, or they're not really learning or not really reading, or they're asking for something that's out of the way. Those are the same technologies, but given different reactions. That's a form of ableism as well. And then lastly, another example is removing disabled inventors from product history. And the example I have here is the OXO vegetable peelers. The story behind that is presented as a husband inventing for his wife who has arthritis, when really the wife is an inventor in her own right as well, if you really get into the story. So that point even goes back to the idea that these diverse perspectives are going to somehow negatively impact our products, when really designing for these diverse perspectives have generally led to a lot of innovations that have been integrated into our society. We've just lost the disability in the narrative of how they came about. With that, I don't have time to go into these in too much depth, but I want to make sure you understand that this is related to what's known as models of disability, basically the ways that you think about disability. And there are three in particular. There are several models, probably more being even discussed as of today, but in particular, there are three that are key to recognize. The first is the medical model, and I've tried to distill them down to just a short phrase. That's very difficult to do. So I encourage you to keep doing your research on these. But essentially, the medical model has a viewpoint that disability is something to be cured. Unfortunately, it has the effect of being used as a justification for institutionalizing people, basically separating people from society if they can't be cured. So that's the medical model, that disability is negative and should be corrected. But there's another social model that was presented that says maybe it's the environment that's disabled, not the person. And so in this sort of model of thinking, at least the goal is to evaluate whether disability can simply be viewed as diversity, and we should be striving for equity and inclusion rather than focusing everything on the person and their particular disability impact. And then there's a third one called the cultural model that basically says disability is a culture or an identity. And we see that in communities such as the deaf community, capital D, deaf community, who says that deaf is a culture. So there's commentary and discussion that could be had about each of these. None of them is perfect. None of them represents one person in total, but they're important to understand and know about, because again, our thinking about disability will impact our research activities and what we do with that information and what we do with those outcomes. So with that, regardless of which, say, model of disability you gravitate towards, the ultimate goal is definitely to avoid a savior complex. And this is particularly for people who are non-disabled and doing this work. So feeling that you need to save disabled people is basically demeaning and detrimental. It's not helpful. And it leads to what's known as disability dongles, a term you can absolutely look up in your favorite search browser, search tool, and you will immediately see a lot of examples of disability dongles. Basically, technology built for disabled people, but not helpful or built in consultation with disabled people. And so they are a lot of popular technologies that someone assumes a person needs and goes and gets funding and builds and gets even magazine coverage about. But when you ask an actually disabled person, they say that's actually not what we needed. And that point right there is the crux of what I'm really trying to get at, that the foundational research, the context, the research along the path helps you get to points where you avoid building something that people actually didn't need. And we know about this in other contexts. We've seen technology fails year after year. Certain companies come out with a smartphone, a tablet, a computer, some sort of transportation device. You know, there's so many tech failures, as we call them. And we wonder, how did they get all the way to the final product and not realize this wasn't going to work well? Because they didn't engage with people and understand the full context of what they built. Likely, I won't say they haven't, likely they didn't do that, or didn't do that in a way that allowed them to really hear the feedback. And so one of my final points here is practice active listening. So earlier I mentioned having an open mind when you're doing this research. Basically, researchers and other stakeholders can often filter data and only accept what aligns with preconceived ideas. But doing research requires being as neutral as possible and analyzing what the data reveals. So that's why it's important to first analyze your viewpoint about disability. I'm not saying you have to have a certain viewpoint, but at least be aware of what it is and make sure that that's not interfering with your ability to interpret what the data or what the people are actually saying that are in your studies. And try your hardest not to filter that data to only align with what you wanted to do or what you wanted to build. Instead, be humble and open enough to realize that there's good and bad ideas out there, and you might be on one side of that or the other, but there's opportunity even in learning that something isn't going to work to make an improvement. So let's work towards that. So a key takeaway in that section is basically disabled people are not waiting for non-disabled saviors. So it's, again, just reiterating the point to be mindful that when we say we want to bring disabled people into research, we're not doing that out of charity or some good-heartedness. We're doing that to include authentic perspectives in the end result of what we're building. So to wrap up, a few final thoughts on this. So to relate this to just generally making good, true progress in our product sector, keep in mind that innovations should move us forward, but if solutions are only for certain people, that's moving us backwards. So more often solutions are found in better understanding, not in just changing or fixing people, or I guess I should have added, or ignoring people altogether. So keeping in mind that really, if we're moving towards good progress, then we should be keeping in mind the diversity of what that includes. An additional takeaway related to that is that disabled people are not solely research participants, they are co-creators and colleagues. So oftentimes when we talk about engaging disabled research participants, there's still somewhat of a mindset that this person is coming in to just be a voice that gives some feedback that then the stakeholders go off and do something with. We don't often realize that we have disabled colleagues, or that, again, disability has led to a lot of innovation presently and in the past. And so I want to, again, re-emphasize that disability is complex. There's a whole disability studies, right? There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of context around it. But at the end of the day, I'm a strong believer that our mindset should include autonomy and independence, and the idea that humans get human rights no matter what. There are not levels to that. So I just want us to be very careful about that as we go about including this in our daily activities. So 3 actions, new actions I would ask that our field embark upon. The first is to conduct more foundational research and reducing research to just final design evaluations. Then share the research findings with the community. I find that often people repeat research sometimes because the others haven't published what they found or what they know. So I think that if we found ways to continue publishing and sharing our insights, that will just strengthen the community. And then lastly, again, assess your personal view on disability as you go, particularly determine if your views are impacting your work. For instance, are you a conduit or are you a gatekeeper? As a researcher and as an accessibility specialist, always love references for more. There's always more to learn. So I've linked a few here in my slides, which are available on the website. That includes the ACM Assets Conference, ACM being the Association for Computing Machinery. I kind of lived there when I was doing my doctorate, and that conference has a wealth of resources for people who have done research with disabled participants, a lot of reflection about doing research and about the field, particularly of late, a lot of great reflective research about the field. So I encourage you to check out that repository if you're able to. Want to call out Just Ask. Integrating Accessibility Throughout Design is a free online resource by a W3C colleague of mine, Sean Henry, that gives those practical tips about facilitating research. The W3C WAI Accessibility Fundamentals has a wealth of resources. I'm now on the Education and Outreach Committee that helps create those resources. So make sure you check that out as a resource that is a sort of official and also, again, free and open source. And then lastly, on LinkedIn, I just happened to see floating around someone, I don't know the person who did it, but they put together an inclusive research resource list and that I thought was pretty phenomenal, and I've linked there as well. And then lastly, as I move to my last slide of how we can stay connected, I'll throw out there that I've been putting a lot of these thoughts and reflections into a book. I can't give too much more information other than to say that it will be a combination of the practical, how do we do this, along with some of those reflections about how do we do this in terms of the intersection of UX research and accessibility. And so if you follow me on LinkedIn or get associated with me via my website, you will find out more about that when I have more that I can share. So we've reached the end of my time, and I welcome your questions and feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was a great session. We really appreciate all of your great information. I'm going to move us into the QA section of the session, and we'll address some of the questions from the participants, which are really excellent. The first question that we'll talk about is, can you speak to the legal and ethical considerations an organization should consider when seeking to recruit users with disabilities? We have this goal for this year, but there's some anxiety about confidentiality, etc.
So I don't see that as a legal implication. If you're talking about confidentiality, there are different ways to recruit. And so if you don't, I believe what you may be getting at is maybe someone isn't comfortable disclosing they have a disability, for instance. So you don't necessarily want to inadvertently expose that if someone is not comfortable with that. One way to get maybe around that is to focus more on the diversity of maybe how people use the computer or would use the product that you are designing, rather than asking specifically about a disability. Depends on the focus of your research, but sometimes I don't necessarily need to know what disability you have. I need to understand how that might impact your going about the usage or the understanding of my product. So sometimes that can give an opportunity for a little more privacy without not being able to do the research at all. So I hope that helps. And there again are a couple of different recruiting strategies that can maybe circumvent having to explicitly disclose that. And again, it also depends on who the researchers are and how private the research is as well. So, but there aren't any like laws or anything like that. But if you want to follow up with me, maybe we can talk a little more about it too.
Thank you. I really like the point that you made about focusing on the way that a user interacts with a computer rather than their specific disability.
Right.
Yeah. Another question that we received is, for qualitative research with a really small sample size of users, for example, under 10, how do you suggest we approach disability representation given the variety of disabilities? For example, will 2 users with specific disabilities, quote unquote, be enough to address other disabilities?
Love that. Thank you so much. First of all, I'm a qualitative researcher. I love it. So I understand about the small numbers. Couple of ways to do that. One is to think about the entire breadth of your research arc. So for instance, you're not going to answer every question with one study. So I think the other way that we need to be thinking about research is that it's longitudinal and it includes multiple studies. So you can include a smaller group of people, but concatenate that data with other data from other studies, and eventually you will build up a more robust understanding and representation by doing multiple studies. But then within an individual study, depending on what your research goals are, there is the opportunity to think about saturation in the data as well. So there's sort of the saturation within that one study and then the triangulation among multiple studies. So the saturation in one study, it will depend. So it kind of depends on what data you get along the way. If 2 people come in and they have similar findings, maybe you don't need a third person. Maybe you want to bring in someone that's different. But if 2 people of similar characteristics come in and have differing experiences, you haven't yet reached your saturation. So then you have to have the opportunity to either add more to that study or create some more studies along the line that will help you get at more of why there were differences or what to do with those differences. So I think the ways to think about it again are, don't think about just one individual study. What's the arc? What's the goal? What's the plan, say, for your entire year of research? And will that entire year help bring about more findings? And then again, those things are also paired with related research too. You're not the only one doing studies probably related to what you're doing. So what does the other data say about that? And that's why I encourage publishing those results, because that's another form of getting saturation and triangulation if we share our results.
Awesome. Thank you for that. That's such great feedback regarding just your thoughts on qualitative research and your own experiences. Another participant asked, I love your insight that it's pretty much guaranteed that any group will include disabled people unless discrimination is actively happening. Would that also extend to places where exclusion is anticipated by disabled people and so they don't try to be included? Basically, is it enough to just not discriminate, or do we need to also practice active inclusion and communicate that outwards so people know they won't be discriminated against in this space?
You take the question mark off, put a period. Amen to all of that. Because what happens is people will say, well, we don't have disabled people in our space because you haven't created the environment welcoming for disabled people. So if you don't create the environment that I know I'm going to have success, I'm going to be welcome, I know I'm going to be able to be included, I'm not going to put myself through trauma trying to be included somewhere where you have not made me welcome. So it is both. Now, you can say that people can advocate, and yes, there are people who have the energy or the stamina to self-advocate and push people towards inclusion, but that should not always have to be their burden. We should be mindful enough of what the, say, guidelines, even say we have enough guidelines out there. What do the guidelines say, and are we creating the environment conducive for the type of inclusion we say we want to have or can have or are looking to have? So love that comment. Thank you.
Awesome. Another person asked, any guidance for where and how to recruit participants for research purposes?
Oh, get my book. So it's difficult. And I say it's difficult because a lot of people will say, for instance, build relationships. Okay, well, we build relationships, but we don't want what we call career participants. So I've built this great relationship with you, but once I've used you in 1 or 2 studies, I can't keep using you because you're going to start to build relationship with us and your feedback is going to be compromised because of that. So we kind of need new people each time to make sure, unless we're doing a longitudinal study or unless we have something like an advisory board, we kind of need new folks with each new study, or at least a longer period of time in between. So that is antithetical of relationship building. There are a few firms that do, if you are in immediate need, there are a few firms that do disability related recruiting, including Knowbility, Knowbility. I would reach out to them and see if they may be able to help or push for recruiting firms to do that, to help you with that. And also there are obviously the disability organizations, but they get hit up a lot. So it can be difficult, but not impossible. And snowball sampling can help as well. So once you find one disabled person, ask them who their friends are, what organizations they are a part of, and maybe you can at least start with some snowball sampling until you can partner with organizations that can help. But I do admit, a lot of people will kind of make it seem easy. No, I know that sometimes it's not easy, but you can do it. Keep at it and keep, coming to things like this. Stay connected with the community. You'll eventually kind of find your place and your well of participants.
Thank you so much for your insight on that. We had quite a few questions in the QA and also in the chat about recruiting. So I think that's really valuable information. We have time for one more question and then we'll wrap up. And so for our last question, we have a participant who commented, fantastic talk, Michelle, but I'm going to need this information every single day. When is your book coming out? So fortuitous, because you mentioned your book. I wondered if you could speak a bit more about your book and the potential release date.
I can't. I'm so sorry. I hoped I would be able to. At this moment, I would lose my publisher if I gave you any more than what I've said so far. This was the approved message I was able to give you. Thank you so much, though. And again, connect with me on social. I'm not the greatest at social, but I'm trying to get better at giving little nuggets, especially with the shift from Twitter to LinkedIn. I'm trying to figure out my voice on doing that on LinkedIn, but continue to connect with me, and soon and very soon, I will be able to give you that. Thank you for that feedback, though, and your enthusiasm about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your comments and your time and your participation in this session. I know I definitely will be following you on LinkedIn after all that you had to say, and really appreciate all of your information.
I appreciate everyone joining, even if it was the recording later on, live, whichever. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.